Hello and welcome to The Front Page. I'm your host, Racing Post editor Tom Kerr, and over the next half hour we are going to thoroughly look over last week's racing news, culminating of course in an incredibly dramatic Grand National entry. I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by senior reporter Chris Cook and writer and broadcaster Maddy Playle. Welcome to you both. And just before we get into all the drama, a quick advert for Racing Post Members Club and a special offer which is available to you right now. And so, the Grand National, one of the most dramatic and high-profile races in years, I think it's fair to say, won in incredible fashion by Corach Rambler, a second win for Scotland after one for Arthur in the last few years, but also a lot of headlines generated by what happened away from the track, or indeed at one stage on the track, as protesters stormed entry. Some of them got on the track trying to disrupt the race, and that has generated great debate about the future of the race, whether anything further should change, and much of that debate coming from the mainstream media, who are taking a heightened interest in the Grand National for reasons good, bad and ugly. Once again. Maddy, let's start with the good though, because Corach Rambler was an incredibly impressive winner. Just superb seeing him creeping into the race. Well, didn't even creep into the race, in fact he was going well all the way. Derek Fox sitting there looking as confident as humanly imaginable. Where does Corach Rambler sit in the sort of Grand National pantheon for you?
I'm quite biased because I love this horse. I've followed him from early stages of his career, and I think there's been it's been said that in a year where there was so much bad press, we had the right winners. In that Lucinda Russell and Peter Scudamore are incredibly passionate, thoughtful commentators on our sport, and we saw that both before and after the race. But I think, yeah, this was a marvellous performance. He was £10 well in, Chris, as I was saying to you beforehand.
I now understand why I should have backed it. If only I could have got it before the
clues
race.
were there, £10 well in.
Yeah, I mean, and this was a sleek bit of campaigning as well. You know, he ran in the Coral Gold Cup, finished fourth there, and then was put away, ran at Cheltenham. He's now unbeaten at Cheltenham and Aintree for 2 Cheltenham Festival handicap chase wins in the Ultima and a Grand National. I mean, what more could you ask? This is a horse who cost 17 grand. He's syndicate owned. One of his owners is only 21 years old. So there are a lot of positive themes to take out of it. Lucinda becoming just the second woman to win it twice after Jenny Pittman. Of course, the winner was Scottish. I think we had 2 in the top 8 with Mr. Coffee, who ran such a bold race for a long way, but the rest Irish.
You mean Britain?
Yes, and the rest Irish. So we're still seeing that domination, but I guess you'd expect that with given the strength in depth among their runners. You know, I think we'll talk more about the problems and the angles this throws up, but ultimately very impressive winner. And I'm really excited to see what he can do next year. And it was good to see the communication afterwards. And I think Lucinda and Peter really spoke for a lot of racing fans with their defence and talking about how much they love the horse.
They are great communicators, and I have to say, it wasn't just about the race that they were great communicators. Beforehand, Lucinda Russell could not have been more positive about Corach Rambler. You know, in the Pinseekers Guide and Racing Post, we had all 40 trainer quotes. I think if you went on trainer quotes alone, Lucinda Russell was the most confident person going into the race, and they made no secret of the fact that they thought they had the perfect horse, the perfect preparation, the perfect weight. The clues were all there. Easy to say in retrospect, but I mean, it was the right winner in some ways.
There is a thing with horses being well in the Grand National, because of course you don't get penalties. This is like, I think it's unique in the British racing calendar, where the weights close in the middle of Feb, And you can do whatever you like after that. You could win 3 races and get no extra weight beyond what you were set in the middle of February. But what's difficult is to run really well at the Cheltenham Festival and then go on to Aintree and run well again. And we've seen lots of horses at Fairyhouse and then again at Aintree in the last few days that ran well at Cheltenham and then kind of underperformed. And historically, that double that he's done is hard to do. I think Seagram was the last one, that's 1991, to win that race, specific race at the festival.
They had the extra week gap, of course, which probably potentially decisive this year, because actually Cheltenham form held up not too badly.
Yeah, he may well have helped him. Although Lucinda seemed clear throughout that he'd taken the race well and he was going to be fine. I mean, he's one of those horses you just don't know where the top of his ability is. And I gather, having spoken to Lucinda's race planner, that he'll be given a chance to be great next season. You know, he'll be put in the graded races. Maybe something like the Charlie Hall would be an interesting place to start off. And if he's going to be a Gold Cup horse, they'll give him that opportunity. He's got this funny head carriage, doesn't he, in the closing stage? I mean, he was idling furiously, I thought, at Cheltenham, which worried me. You know, even if I was thinking about backing him otherwise, I'd have been worrying about that long run in at Aintree, how's he going to cope with that? And he did it again, didn't he?
We were saying, weren't we, I was actually watching it abroad on my phone and sort of saw him tanking throughout. Lots of people saying, oh, he's going to get too far behind, he'll be impeded by what's going on in front of him. I mean, he was in 6th, 7th all the way, absolutely tanking. But no, my coverage cut out just as he went clear to go to the elbow, and I saw this grey horse running on. I thought, gosh, he's going to put his head in the air and idle as he does, and it took me a few minutes to get confirmation that he won the race. But I think he's just an extraordinary horse, isn't he? I mean, the Constitution, still only had, I think, the 13 starts under rules or something like that. I mean, incredibly cleverly campaigned as well. He's got that, you know, unique facial marking, sticks his head up in the air. He's a real characterful horse.
So cleverly bought as well. I mean, I gather Skew really warmed to him, even though you know, looking objectively at what he'd done in the point-to-point field, 17 grand was about the right price, you know, but he was sort of sweetening him from the moment they got him. We should give a shout out to Vanillier, who finished so strongly, because I'm sure there are people out there who feel that, you know, had his effort begun a bit earlier, or if he'd managed to sort of stay a bit closer to the pace before that kind of final finishing kick that we know he has, the result might have been different. I think it's hard to reimagine that race in any way that swaps around the first 2 placings. But look, if you've backed Vanillier, you're feeling pretty sore about the fact he was closing all the way to the line and just had 2 lengths to make up. You know, if you leave your effort too late in the Grand National, you know, that's something to regret over 4 1/4 miles.
Absolutely. How many of those stories are there in the Grand National? One person who's certainly not regretting anything, Derek Fox. Unbelievable ride, but so almost missed the race. I mean, what a remarkable young man he is. Now 2 Grand Nationals, and they made exactly the right call not to come back early. He missed a race riding a Hoy Senior, much to his disappointment, but was proven to be the right decision.
I was a big fan of Corrick anti-post, and I must admit, when there were rumours about Brian Hughes taking the ride, I was a bit nervous because, as we've said, he is a bit of a I'm not sure he's ungenuine or quirky, but he takes some knowing, and Derek clearly knows him really, really well. He's got a unique story as well, you know, wasn't particularly gifted at school and has taught himself to read, I think, in recent years, and has really become an avid reader from not being very well grounded in that sphere initially. And I think Davy Russell said it brilliantly on telly on Sunday that, you know, he's just a real horseman, and having been to the yard and spoken to Lucinda and Peter, it's just organic, it's natural with him. Everything he does, it's ingrained in him already. You know, they've clearly helped hone a talent, and they've got some great jockeys. I mean, we saw Stephen McQueen riding Apple Away, and Patrick Wodge, another jockey who's had a fantastic couple of weeks, and clearly Peter's influence there is showing, but equally they're just building such a fantastic team around them. You know, they've made a habit of buying horses from, you know, for not much money at all. They bought 2 horses out the same point to point who have been very good this year. Snake Roll and DeLegislator, who have won quite a lot of money. So I find their approach very interesting. They're building a strong foundation for their horses. They're going to be a force to be reckoned with in the next couple of years, clearly.
Just on Derek, I mean, it'd be really good to see him become a bit more fashionable, a bit more popular, because it didn't happen in the wake of 1-4-Arthur winning the National. I guess a lot of people are sort of mindful that a real range of jockeys have won Nationals over the years, but now he's done it twice in 6 years. And it showed real guts to ride the favourite in the Grand National in a way that most people did not expect. They thought he'd be a hold-up horse. Then that appears to have been Derek's decision and absolutely vindicated. If he's only ever riding for Lucinda Russell, that's a great gig. But I would like to see him being offered some more chances. He clearly deserves it. You wonder what more he'd have to do. Absolutely.
Well, one final word we have to reflect on, I think, Chris, is very important in this. We're probably now at the stage where we're talking not so much about a British crisis of competitiveness, but an English crisis, because Scotland,
I've already been corrected.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think I see now what's going to dominate the comments underneath this video. It's an interesting point, though. I think if you take the last 4 runnings of each of the major 4 Grand Nationals, so England, Aintree, Scotland, Welsh and Ireland, you're talking about 2 English winners, which would be Nicky Richards won the Scottish version and Nicky Martin won the Welsh version last time it was run. Otherwise, you can't get an English winner in the Grand National lately. The last one was Menny Clowes. By the time you get to the next year's Grand National, that'd be 9 years ago.
Yeah.
And I mean, there was really not much sign of that coming, because it was 8 English trained winners in a row up to that point. Only 13 British runners in this year's race. I think that's an entrenched trend, having more Irish runners than representatives from anywhere else. I think Lucinda's just bucked a trend. The strength is in Ireland and will continue to be so.
Let's turn to some of the uglier stuff that happened around the race. We need to reflect on the protest, which so almost derailed the race. We had over 100 arrests made as protesters from the activist group Animal Rising attempted to breach the perimeter of the track. Several of them got onto the track and tried to attach themselves to fences. Thankfully, it turns out it's quite hard to attach yourself to fences made of loose spruce and detachable plastic. But Chris, should it have even happened? I mean, it's not like this was a secret that this was going to happen. It was probably the most well-flagged protest in racing history, and yet they still go on the track.
Fully a fortnight in advance, we got the splash story one Sunday that this was going to happen, which made me think, I must say, that this was really more about publicity than anything else, and drawing attention to themselves. The activist group in question have rebranded within the last week, I think it was, from one name to another. So part of you thinks that attaching themselves to the Grand National is all very convenient timing for them, and they have massively raised their profile.
Yeah.
I'm afraid that most people involved with them will regard this as a tremendous success, even though I think realistically they had no hope on earth of actually stopping the race. And set in that context, what they were doing was reckless. They were sort of engaged in a sort of criminal break-in around the perimeter fence at Aintree, when there is a risky sports activity about to take place there in what is supposed to be a secure environment, where we're trying to maintain as much calm as you possibly can in those circumstances, so that the competitors are able to do the best that they can. And since then, of course, we've had Sandy Thompson, who very sadly lost Hill 16 at the first fence, pointing the finger directly at these protesters and saying that the extra time that we were made to wait before the race was at least a contributing factor to his horse boiling over, other horses boiling over, and Hill 16 falls for the very first time in his career and very sadly sustains a fatal injury.
And it was striking that the first couple of fences were by a distance the worst in the race in terms of losing, having fallers onto the riders. I think we had 8 the first 2 fences compared to 2, 1 and 2 over recent runnings. Do you just attribute that to the delay and the extra sort of stress that put on runners and riders indeed as well?
It can't have helped. I think there's lots of things that we need to discuss over a period of time, and knee-jerk reactions are almost certainly going to be misguided. We should resist that as much as possible. This race has been around for a very long time. We've made a number of changes in recent years which we fully believe have improved the safety, managed the risk, as it were.
The stats do back this up, and I think that's important. And the BHA and others have been quite forward, front foot forward with this year. You know, they're pointing out that the fatality rate has more than halved since the 2020 review. We had no fatal injuries in 6 running. Sadly, of course, there's been several since then. And that the number of fallers has fallen from over 10 to 5. And indeed, I think actually Saturday's race was consistent with those numbers. So there have been improvements. However, World Horse Welfare, who work with British racing, have said much more needs to be done. They've come up with quite a strong statement afterwards. They've said it cannot continue in the current vein. We need to reflect, but then further changes need to happen. They've highlighted things such as the number of runners, more ways to reduce fallers, better management of loose horses, and a better managed start. What's your view on that, Maddy?
Yeah. Firstly, you know, I come from this a little bit detached, having not seen the race live and been fully immersed in everything beforehand. But I was struck by the amount of people, not just outside of racing, but inside racing, who found that first circuit distasteful and uncomfortable and hard to watch. And I think that is something that we should be rightfully listening to. And those points that you just referenced, they make a lot of sense. You know, we can't eliminate this risk, but we have that issue of perception. You know, if something looks bad now, it automatically is bad almost in the modern context of this new society. And I think, you know, for me, and again, this was mentioned previously, the parade would be an interesting thing. If we were to get rid of that parade, would that help keep runners and riders calm? Perhaps there's a way we can move the start or change the start in another way, or, you know, maybe just, Chris, we were talking beforehand about riders and their influence and how they approach the race, perhaps. And also, you know, changing the field size and moving that down, because that's going to, you know, obviously decrease the amount of loose horses. But ultimately, I think the way for racing to approach this is transparency, communication, and being proactive. And those 3 things, I think, have got to be at the forefront of what we're doing. There's, from some corners, there's this sort of stoic view of racing isn't doing anything wrong and these protesters don't know anything about horses and blah, blah, blah. And I think Lee covered it so brilliantly in his column that there are an awful lot of people that occupy the middle ground, and they should be our focus. And with the likes of Kevin Blake and Richard Hoyle speaking out, those are the sort of people we want, you know, well-informed, data-driven communication to outsiders.
On that, I mean, those guys did a great job, and others have as well over the last few days. But it slightly irritates me that the sport itself doesn't have a single identifiable figure who would be the one that TV producers, for example, from Good Morning Britain, would immediately know to go to in a situation where our sport is being discussed on their show.
It's almost been taken upon us internally, hasn't it?
Well, the sport's done it.
Yeah.
You know, I was actually reflecting on this over the weekend, and I actually thought, given that this is sort of almost an existential thing, because we're talking about the future of races like the Grand National, we're talking about the social license of racing to operate, surely there should be actually quite a well-funded, centralised sort of plan, strategy for how do we deal with this, you know, because Lee's absolutely right. You need to worry not about the antis who are never going to like racing, but about the largely indifferent middle who will make their decision about whether they think racing is acceptable or not based on basically osmosis of 1,000 different factors. And if you want to influence these people, if you want them to be hearing the right things that makes them think, yes, racing's a positive, then you need to think about it quite strategically. With the best will in the world, I agree that Kevin Blake and Richard Hoyle did a fantastic job, but you know, going on a couple of talk shows around the Grand National is great, but that's only the beginning, and you need to have a year-round strategy that involves getting
that's reaction,
good messages
isn't it?
out.
And that's what we always do. We're chasing after the story.
Yeah.
And even Kevin only gets on there because he goes out there on social media and he starts responding to the Good Morning Britain show and gets adopted onto another show. But if he doesn't do that, if he's got, as you would understand, he's got his own work to do, if he's got his head in the Grand National for him that day, then that doesn't happen.
Where's the sort of high-powered communications firm, the sort of election winners?
Well, it has to be someone who comes across as not too
I'm
well-read.
I'm not suggesting they should be the public face, but they should be thinking about, well, this is how we get messages out to the widest number of people, and this is how we win hearts and minds, which is ultimately the game we're in now.
And I think that for me as well, having a lot of friends who aren't interested in racing and of this younger generation who are, really aware and very minded of how we treat animals in this modern society, I still think there's a huge gulf in between what people think horse racing is and what it actually is. And for me, that education, that exposure, that teaching almost of our sport is one of the most important things we can do. Not only to keep the Grand National thriving, but also to keep our sport healthy. We're in an environment now where attendance figures are plummeting at an alarming rate. Racing needs to equip more fans and recruit them to sustain our sport effectively. And I think that is one of the things I would love to see. Not the BHA reacting to some tweet saying, "Oh, we'll read our information here." This has got to be data driven, and we've got to be proactive in putting it out there so it's digestible and people are going to actually see and relate to it, rather than just going, well, if you disagree with us, here's a link. I'm not sure it's the most effective way to get people on side.
Just to your point there about the importance of recruiting fans, the Grand National has traditionally been a huge factor in that. I mean, I think there are lots of us, there's never been a study to measure exactly how many, but anecdotally there's loads of us around whose first contact was with the National or for whom that was the cementing factor. It's the one race that everybody watches on telly, and there are loads of little kids who that's their first point of contact with racing. As we were discussing earlier, it's got that the drama of the National is something that really draws you in when you're young, and then you develop more sophisticated taste, and maybe in a few years you pride yourself in the fact that the Cheltenham Gold Cup has become your favourite race, or maybe the Epsom Derby even.
That's one thing that racing is almost unlucky, is that one of our shop windows to the public is inherently, there is risk attached, and unfortunately we can't eliminate that risk.
But I imagine that the two are not unrelated to a degree, because when I was a little boy watching the Grand National, it was all about the drama of it, the colour, the excitement, the noise, and
the stories we retell every year, Foynaven, other incidents like that.
These jockeys are heroes to us because of the dangers that they're prepared to face.
And the horses as well.
Yeah, exactly.
You admire their courage, and I think it's important for racing not to forget that, we do need to think about welfare. We do need to continually review what we're doing in order to make the sport as safe as it reasonably can be. But there's a lot spoken about, the fact that risk is inherent to the sport. And it's important that we in racing do acknowledge that and have two-hand explanations about why we believe that the level of risk inherent in the sport is acceptable.
And you never hear that. There's one thing that irritates me from the people that run the game just now. Whoever is going to be that focal point in the future in defending our reputation has to be completely comfortable with the fact that there is an element of risk, and there always will be. And I think the public out there, for the most part, are also comfortable with that idea. As long as they see you making a concerted effort to keep it under manageable proportions, they get impatient with being told that there should be no risk in their lives and that they have to be wrapped in cotton wool all the time. I think most people are comfortable with a sport that allows the level of risk that we see in our sport every day. And so we should be prepared to go out there. But I mean, it came up again in the whip debate. I felt like the senior figures at the BHA weren't prepared to go out there and actually make the case for the whip in the first place. It was all quite sort of defensive stuff. And I think when people see you adopting that defensive posture, they instinctively feel that you must be wrong and you've got something to hide.
I completely agree with that. And that sort of raises an interesting question about what's going to happen through the rest of this summer, because and indeed into next year when the Grand National comes around again, I think it's pretty clear that we haven't seen the last of Animal Rising. They had a massive sort of publicity coup on Saturday, and perhaps the media has given them more coverage than it ought to, but nonetheless it's happened now, and Animal Rising have had an incredible platform on which to state their demands. Now, the interesting thing for me is I think Animal Rising actually probably have very little popular support indeed, because they're not against racing or the Grand National, they're against the use of animals generally. So they're in favour of veganism. I remember when the original Scoop came out, one of the other civil disobedience actions they were going to take was sort of sit-ins at non-vegan restaurants, which is exactly. So actually, if there is a summer of Animal Rising, I actually think that racing is quite well positioned to be on the sort of the side of the great mass who sort of look at these people and think, Jesus,
what a bunch of losers.
Yeah, they sort of like
people who glue themselves to the M25,
exactly. When they're not dipping into their trust fund. How do you see it unfolding, Maddy? I mean, it's obviously the thought that there could be more disruption at major races is pretty alarming.
Yeah, I must admit, it wasn't my first thought to think this is going to happen again immediately at other events, because the Grand National is so unique in that respect, in the amount of people that watch it all over the world. This was clearly an attempt to grab publicity, and it maybe isn't going to be, I couldn't see it happening at midweek at Uttoxeter or somewhere like that, but perhaps it will. Perhaps this is just the start of a bigger movement for them.
I think the chances of them finding their way to Uttoxeter are pretty slim. It's hard enough for me, and I've been there before.
But they could be, if they wanted to go and target Epsom, let's be honest, I mean, they managed to get through probably the most extensive security ring of steel you will find at any race meeting in Britain.
Yeah.
And let's not forget Extinction Rebellion at Royal Ascot last year as well.
Absolutely.
They chained themselves to the race course. Yeah.
Epsom, the Scottish National, they're basically they're soft targets, really, because they're so hard to police such a huge perimeter.
Yeah, there's definitely some risk there if they decide they want to keep picking on us. I think the Scottish National might not be a great choice for them, because the crowd there, love their racing, and would be fully prepared to stand alongside the cops.
As the good people of Merseyside were as well,
yes,
which was fantastic to see as they were lobbing the ladders over the fence, and I imagine that was a hair-raising moment for the young Tarquins and Eleanors.
You would think they'd be wondering what on earth have we got ourselves into in this strange and terrible place. We'll have to see. I mean, I did a little bit of research into this group and what they've done in the past. I mean, up to this point, their kind of activities are the sort of stuff that is just naturally going to make them terribly unpopular with most people. They walk into shops and they pick up sort of pints of milk and pour it on the floor, because you're not allowed to have cow's milk. There was one of them who pursued Sir David Attenborough into a seafood restaurant where he was just having a night out with pals, yelling at him, for supporting such a place, the 96-year-old national treasure. It seems to me that from the exposure that they've had up to now, they don't have much judgment about what's going to make them friends and what isn't.
I think we can laugh about this in a way, as we are doing, but at the same time, there are going to be more sophisticated forms of opposition to racing, and we should be prepared to tackle that. And as you've said, Tom, in how we do that is going to be key to the future of our sport. I'm not sure this group in particular is the one that we should be necessarily concerned about in terms of forcing change, but that doesn't mean another isn't going to come along and we shouldn't be prepared to deal with that.
Yeah, I agree. These are extremists, and as we said before, it's the middle ground you need to worry about. Now, I always think the most important thing that racing can do to ensure it has a long and prosperous future is the simplest: popularity.
Yeah.
The more fans you have, the safer you are, the more robust your foundations are, because that is ultimately what will determine whether there's ever any appetite from outside the sport to demand more radical changes. The Grand National, I think, has always been racing's great shop window. The sort of question I'm going to put to you now is, does it remain a great asset for the sport, or is it increasingly a bit of a problem as well because it generates these discussions more often than not?
Look at me.
I'll go first. I mean, I think it's a huge net asset, although clearly not without its problems. And I think there is a risk from, guys like you and me who've been around a long while, if you get tired of having these discussions at a sort of personal level, or, if you've seen the race a lot of times and you've been there, in my case, it might be 30 times I've been to the Grand National. And you start to get a bit old and jaded and you go, oh, well, maybe you're right, maybe we should just dispense with it. Forgetting that it's part of your job to maintain these things that you've enjoyed over many decades for generations still to come, in the way that, the people who came before us preserved this race. They were having these same arguments. There were people who were annoyed about the race back in the 50s. MPs who stood up in Parliament and lobbied against it. So I think you have to try and maintain your resolve on subjects like this. People you can see on Twitter, they don't want to feel like they're the bad guy, and they hate to be having these discussions and trying to explain complex questions about welfare and risk and fatality rates. They just rather, avoid that whole thing altogether. And so you see people who, enjoy a bit of flat racing going, can we not just get rid of this blooming race?
Yeah.
But it's a great mistake. You've got to be tougher than that. You've got to find the strength from within yourself to make the cogent arguments that are there to be made about how this sport is a huge net benefit to the thoroughbred breed and to all horses generally, because the fact that racing exists means that there's a huge investment every year in veterinary science, from which all horses benefit.
Well said, Maddy.
Yeah, I think the Grand National is unique, because of the amount of people that view it, and because of it as a test. It's a remarkable stamina test. The fences are different. So because of that, it's not representative of what we see during our sport, during the rest of the season, whether that be over jumps or on the flat. So it's difficult for racing to sell itself on one event that is almost an outlier in a way. But as we mentioned before, that's part of the appeal. That's part of why it is the exceptional challenge that it is. So I think ultimately it's just about finding that balance between preserving the race, its legacy, what it stands for, and also doing all we can to minimise risk and to look after the sports participants and keep the race in a mould that is acceptable to wider society.
And one point I would add is, it's not as though racing is choosing the Grand National as its shop window. We're not able to direct all those eyeballs. No. The reason it is because people are drawn to it because of the amazing spectacle, because it's so unique in the world. We're not in control of that, and we shouldn't pretend that we are.
And 7.5 million people watching on Saturday, a full house. The great race remains a truly national event, and long may it continue. We'll bring it to a close there. We've all spoken about the same subject, but I guess the question that presents is that which angle makes the front page? And my view is it's Cork Rambler, because despite the protests, despite some of the controversy and the debate around the race, it remains a sensational sporting event. We had a truly fantastic winner, great connections this year. So Cork Rambler, not the protesters, goes on the front page.
Good decision.
Thank you very much for joining us this week. We will be back next week with more racing debate on all the big topics. Before we go, a quick advert for our app. But thanks very much for joining us.